Guys, good morning and welcome to the second episode of A Conversation, podcast brought to you by the Bernese Magazine. I'm Paul and today we're going to talk about the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. I'm here with three guests today. I think it's best if you guys just introduce yourself and talk a bit about what is your connection to the whole issue, to the topic. What is your motivation to be here today to say something about it? I'm really happy that you're all here.
Sure. Hi, my name is Barbora. I'm from Lithuania originally. And in terms of this topic, I feel personal attachment in terms of collective memory of our region and the country I come from. So I've been here and I came back. I've been there like a week ago. And in Lithuania, the whole situation is pretty intense. We have emergency state and we are very sensitive in terms of this topic. And when I came here, I already mentioned to you before, guys, that it feels like a completely different universe, even though it's like a 1.5 hour flight, right? So I just think it's important to talk about this today.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Wojtek. I'm from Poland. I haven't lived in Poland, but my family's there, so it's a bit of a personal issue.
Hello, my name is Yulia, and I'm from Ukraine. And I must agree that when you just hear it and it just feels like a totally different world, when you just look at the news and you just see something that was so familiar before, or like the place you've been to, or the place that you usually hang out to, and it just like looks just distorted and empty, which is like really, really hard. So I think it's important to set some light on the issue that's going on right now.
Definitely, yeah. That's what we're trying to do today, to set some light on the whole topic, to understand the whole conflict. I'm pretty convinced we have to look more into some historical aspects to understand the present political tensions that are going on.
Absolutely. But I think before we start talking about history, we also need to answer why we talk about history. Even though it seems self-explanatory, I think we agree that identities are based on history. But history is very fluctuous, really fluid and really ever-changing concept. So it always also matters the way we interpret history, because that conveys the very desire of what we people or as a nation aspires to be. So when we talk about history today of Russia or USSR, we not only look into history as such as it exists out there, but also the way they chose to interpret it.
Couldn't agree more. Like, if I just gonna add real quick, because I think especially now we can see like how different the perspective, even like the history is making right now, is being introduced, and that's interesting to see how it was before, because I think it's kind of going to correlate with how it's going to be in the future, because I'm sure it's going to be in the history books and people are going to be, oh my god, like this was so crazy. And I think that the history will show how crazy it was back then.
I also think it's interesting to note how the history that we as Eastern Europeans learn is a bit different from that which is taught in Western European curriculums and international curriculums.
True.
Where for us as Eastern Europeans, what's happening right now in Ukraine isn't as much of a surprise due to our knowledge of history.
Absolutely. It has a lot to do with historic justice. So just today, right now, I want to go through some dates, I guess, to give some context, but also just dive into this history numbers, let's call it. So just to give a little bit, sort of dates and chronology to wrap your head around this part of the world. USSR, former USSR, was created in 1917 after Great October Socialist Revolution. So between 1723, we have a really bloody civil war, Reds against the White ones. Reds, Bolsheviks win and they take over the power. 1922, we have delegations from Ukraine, from Transcaucasia, and from Russia coming and signing the Treaty of Establishment of USSR. Now, what is really important in the development of USSR is when Stalin comes into power, because in 1927, when he comes into power, Russian nationalism becomes very much entrenched with the communist idea of Russia. But then this Russian nationalism is also wrapped in this nostalgia for Russian Empire, for this glorious empire. And then in 1938, that's what is important for today's context, is when Hitler and Stalin signs Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And with that pact, they divide spheres of influence. And if you want a parallel, think Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Middle East. Basically, they just carved the map. So everything from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, east of Poland, North Bukovina, which is current Romania, goes to Stalin, and USSR invaded in 1994, and they occupied those territories. By the way, in reference to today's Ukraine, in 1939, they also invade Finland, and based on the security reasons, which really rings the bells. They literally invaded saying, oh, we need to defend Leningrad, let's just invade it.
Which is like really interesting to see how it actually is going right now, which is pretty much the same thing.
Absolutely the same thing. And I think it's I mean, that's what you just said, right? That when you know this history, it's not surprising at all because there is a pattern, and they just follow the very same pattern. And then a few more things that I want to add, even though I've been speaking for quite a bit, to know how this history sort of evolved or how they exercise communism there. So, for instance, for you just to imagine, 1937, 1938, those are a period of 2 years called, Stalin is exercising two great purges, which means that they execute more than 1,000 persons every single day. In the period of 2 years, that constitutes from, 700,000 to up into 1 million people. Then we have Katyn massacre in Poland, 22,000 people. 22, just to give you a parallel, we have Srebrenica massacre, which is 8,000 people. I don't like comparing bad things, but just to give it a perspective. USSR established gulags. 40 million people go through that system. Those are like forced labor camps. 40 million people, more than the population of current Belgium. So when you know these numbers and when you know the way USSR sort of evolved, what is happening today is not surprising at all, I think, in my perspective.
I mean, we also talk about the kill lists that you hear about in the news, about how Putin has a kill list of high-ranking pro-Ukraine people who live in these Ukrainian cities. This is also not new. If you look at the massacres that you just mentioned, a lot of the people that, for example, Stalin would target were the intelligentsia. Those were like the intelligent or the higher-ranking people within society who supported their local governments and who had to be taken out. And these people were strategically taken out in order to undermine society as a whole and reduce the opposition to the Soviet Union.
Absolutely, because in terms of the estimates that I read, they deported 6 million people from the territories they occupied in the West. And I think what's also really important, we're not just throwing numbers just to show how Stalin or how horrible it was, because then they say, oh, Hitler was also bad. That's correct. But there is a big major difference here. Because in the West, for instance, Germany, up until this day, they pay reparations for Holocaust survivors. In the West, you have the whole school developed based on the idea that colonialism was bad, right? There is sort of people admit for their wrongdoings. Whereas in Russia, they glorified that part of the history. They deny any of wrongdoings. You have Lenin and sculptures of Lenin and Stalin all over the country. And that's what I meant by interpretation of the history. When you see the idols, the glorification for that very bloody past, it's not surprising at all. And that's how you understand modern Russia. Modern Russia is not a normal, regular nation state or democracy, or a liberal democracy, which is oxymoron in itself, right? It's an empire, and it collapsed. It's correct that it collapsed. There was a dissolution, but it's still an empire. And the mentality that people have is still very imperial.
Which is also interesting about the mentality, because even now, like, you can see on the modern situation that a lot of people don't even know what exactly is going on. Like, a lot of people are being literally just surprised about, like, what war. It's a lot of people being told that, for instance, they're going there to Ukraine for the trainings. They're going there to save people. And I think that's important in terms of the perspective and like on the mentality, because it's forming not so like from the people, but from the government and the media. And like right now, people just like there's a lot of instances when people they just go to Ukraine and then they text their like loved ones, "Mom, it's not trainings." Like, it's just not what people tell us. It's just, for me, it's crazy that it just goes from like not even the people, but from the power of the political views.
Yeah. But would you say this more imperial idea, this idea of forming a new empire, is more an idea that is also dispersed throughout civil society in Russia? How do you guys perceive this idea, or do you think this is more an elite project? Because I feel like those are really two differing spheres.
I think that's a difficult question, but I think in general, a lot of people, as we can see now, happening now when Russia is cutting off a lot of Western news sources, most of especially the older generations, and I would say this for Poland as well, a lot of them mostly take their news at face value from the government. And so while this might be an elite project, it's disseminated through state media and propaganda into general society. And so what you end up having is these older generations taking everything that Putin says as the truth and nothing but the truth. And so I think that's a fundamental issue.
I think one more thing to add to it, and I think it has more historic complexity, because elites in Russia are not the same elites that we have in the West. It's very much of a different concept. And I think...
In what way different?
Okay, let's put it that way, that because Russian nationalism was such an important part for Russia, a lot of Russians felt very, they belonged to something very big and glorious. And then in the 1990s, when USSR collapsed, Russia was humiliated. It collapsed, the economy collapsed. Therefore, there's this very big Soviet nostalgia to belong to something great again. And I think for a common or a regular person, it becomes a big part of what his identity is based on, right? So it's more complex than that. It's not just a civil project, civil society and elites. I would argue even that civil society, that bits of it that are left there and holding on against the regime, you can even them call some sort of elite, right? Because elitism, again, then there's a question, what is elitism? Is it based on money? Because in Russia, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
I agree.
I mean, I would say that Russia right now is the last remaining imperialistic nation in Europe. If not the world, you could argue for the United States being another imperial kind of power, imperial thinking power. But this idea of thinking of spheres of influence and the way that Putin does is something that dates back to the 19th century, and I would argue that it's outdated in our world today. I mean, the EU to Putin represents something a bit alien. It's a post-colonial kind of concept of nations, different nations, more than 20 nations working together, right? And so for Putin, he doesn't understand this, I think, because for him, he sees Russia as an empire that needs to expand its borders and take territory wherever it can, and the EU's primarily based on cooperation between states rather than expansion.
Just about the one that said that the Putin wants to take the territories wherever he can. I think it's my personal perspective what is going on, that he wants, as you were talking about the Russian Empire of its glory and stuff, he wants to take back what it was before. So he wants to kind of recreate the Soviet Union, which is, I think he's going to go for the past Soviet countries, so the ones that were involved in the Soviet Union as a whole. And I think he's not going to go too far. Maybe he's not going to go with the war too far if it's something happens, God no. But I think his perspective now is to get everything back, quote unquote, normal, how he wants it to be.
So do you guys think this could be also assessed rather as an act of revenge in terms of regarding the humiliation after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, that the West for so long derogating basically the rules? So do you think this could be also seen as kind of a revenge or a payback to the West?
Absolutely. And there were a lot of let's say debates or comments in terms of that made. And I think one of the main things that sort of signals the fact that Putin is actually want to come back to this militarized, glorious Russia is when he came into power in the 2000s. One of the first of 10 decrees that he signed was to bring back military education to schools, right? So it already indicates what he wants the future generation of Russia to be: militarized country based on a very strong power.
Yeah, definitely. True. In terms of, we talked a lot about the Russian perspective right now, and as you said before, the Russian perspective is heavily influenced by the role of media, of course, and by Russian state media, since all independent media sources are banned currently. Yesterday we saw one person making a clear statement in Russian TV, holding up a sign. But we not only have the perception of Russian media, we also have the whole role of the Western media and how Western media portrays the conflict, also in terms of the position of China in this whole conflict. How do you lately, I mean, we all see a lot of news, we all read a lot of articles. How do you lately see the role of the news agencies that you are following? Do you see that more critically? Do you think it's more impartial?
I want to say a little bit about the banning of the Russian media. I think that the fact that the Western media is being blocked in Russia and the Western media is like kind of refusing also to be there, I think will have a huge impact on the society's perspective on the war. Because when you have only one source that you look, okay, so this is the only source we have. So like, why do we have to try to break in to get another source if this one is free and this one is still telling us, well, quote unquote truth? And and also like, I don't think, it's my personal thought that banning the media is not really a good idea, because now the West also doesn't have an idea of what's happening in Russia, what kind of media is being spread through Russian media. So you don't really understand what's going on from both sides.
In terms of that, I would tend to disagree, especially because in East Europe you have this huge population of Russians. And as a person who lived in Lithuania, and we live with Russians side by side, and those and those people end up being exposed to the only source that they know, which is, well, Russian propaganda, Russian news in Russian. Maybe it's also, I mean, I agree, it's also a fault of a state itself that it doesn't provide alternative in Russian language. So, but there's already reforms made in that term. But you have to, knowing how good is USSR and Russia propaganda machine, they did it for, well, 100 years, you need to isolate certain, you need to stop and prevent disinformation in coming in. So I agree in a sense that it sort of creates this almost a Berlin Wall. You don't know what's happening, but yet we have an access to see what's going on there, right? People keep on sharing what is being told in Russian media. For some reason, I know what is being shared in Russian media. The problem is that Western media doesn't really get into Russia.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a I don't think it's a both way. It doesn't go both ways.
True. Yeah, I think it's more that the Western media doesn't get to Russia. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I agree. And I think one thing we have to look at also is the Russian perspective and how they view or how they try to justify this invasion. And one claim that's often made is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a response to NATO aggression. Now, this kind of links back to my whole claim before that it's kind of 19th century imperialist thinking of how spheres of influence work. And the fact of the matter is that NATO has grown as countries have sought to protect themselves from Russian imperialism. You have examples such as the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014.
Right. And in terms of that claim, by the way, it's also a little bit of a myth. And the thing that Putin keeps on referring is the agreement that they made in 1991 or 1990s, I'm not sure. But that agreement was only concerned east of Germany. There was agreement that there wouldn't be NATO, there would no be another military of other NATO countries on the East Germany soil. It didn't talk about NATO expansion. There's no treaty signed whatsoever. And it's a bit of a created myth somehow the world believes, and it's very unfortunate.
And I think it shows exactly my point now that now that Russia invades Ukraine, you have countries like Finland who are considering NATO membership. This is a direct response to Russian aggression. So it's the same thing happening again. And it just proves my point even further, I think.
Do you think that Putin maybe even miscalculated some of his strategic moves right now? That he actually, maybe he was aware of that fact, but to actually strengthen maybe NATO even?
I think there's no doubt about that. I think Putin, paradoxically, ironically, has done more for strengthening European unity than the last 20 years of diplomacy has. So.
Yeah, it's true. It also goes to the Ukrainian people, because we were kind of torn after the 2014. Some people were saying, because I think we'll talk later about 2014, so I'm not going to go in depth now. But like that, this whole conflict strengthened our people even more than it was throughout the 30 years of our country being independent. And this also shows now that all people that had to leave due to actually like the danger, they say that we're going to come back, we're going to rebuild it, and no one's going to stop us from that. So it's not the idea that we left to Europe, finally, great lives. No, like everyone wants to come back.
And I think in terms of miscalculation, I mean, I'm not stretched as far from it, but I think we read a lot of articles. The initial idea of Putin was to take over Ukraine really quickly. And I think he was surprised himself with the resistance that Ukrainians came back. Plus, on top of that, because these atrocities are lasting for so long, the world is starting to see what's going on. So as you said, Europe is more united than ever, which is, I mean, sadly at such a cost, but this is true.
I still don't think the West realizes, though, the potential that there is for the expansion of conflict beyond Ukraine. I still think people think this is solely happening in Ukraine. It's not going to go outside the borders because, for whatever reason, Putin doesn't want to test NATO, Putin doesn't want to test the EU. I think he has the capacity to do so.
He's already doing it. He was already testing it.
And the Ukraine right now is the front line of NATO, of the EU, right? And if Ukraine had fallen much quicker than like everyone anticipated, or in a shorter amount of time, then I think we'd be in a lot more trouble than we are right now.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, like you said, people don't realize how close it is. The attack, I think, a couple of days ago was 20 kilometers from Polish border. This is insane. And also, for instance, was it yesterday or the day before, there was actual footage from national news in Russia where on the, evening show, they're discussing the seizure of Baltic states. I mean, it looks surreal. It's like a fantasy movie, but they literally in front of you, there are 4 men discussing seizure of the Baltic states, how they will deploy military and how they're going to take over. And we are talking 21st century.
Yeah. I think there was also some misinformation from Western media. For example, there was recently a claim that the West somehow failed Ukraine in the sense of keeping its promise to guarantee its sovereignty when it gave up nuclear arms. While you could make an argument that yes, we have failed Ukraine in many ways already, you have to realize also that that agreement was signed along with Russia. So Russia was one of the countries that signed the Budapest Memorandum that promised that if Ukraine went ahead with nuclear disarmament, then it would guarantee its sovereignty, and it has broken that memorandum.
It's also now the most dangerous thing, I think, apart from the people dying and the war itself. The nuclear thing is really, really dangerous because it was news a few days ago that actually Russia is holding the nuclear right now, and we have 5 or 6, if I'm not mistaken, places where there's 4 and more, I think 4 or 6, I'm not sure, nuclear actual thing. So it's just crazy because if it blows up, it's not only Ukraine's gonna freaking die.
Referring to the nuclear power plants?
Yes.
Yeah. And those are definitely hotspot. I think the fact that Russia's the biggest deterrent right now in terms of the West responding to Russian aggression is that nuclear threat. I mean, you could draw parallels between Russia and North Korea at this point, because the only reason North Korea exists as it is right now is because of its nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was even, they said, I think, a week ago or so, that basically there are more sanctions imposed in Russia than in North Korea at this very point. Russia is in North Korea. It's crazy.
But is that enough?
That's a good question. And what you said before, it's really sad that the response of European nations always has to it only starts working when there's an external threat, when there's an external enemy. And but then again, we could see how well actually the cooperation works on many levels, especially on the levels of refugees. I mean, there was a lot of collections for money, clothes, food, and so on, medicine, for Ukrainian refugees right now, which on the one hand is of course an amazing thing to see, how nations and people can actually work together and accomplish something like this. On the other hand, if you compare it to the 2015 situation, is also kind of a frustrating thing to see at the same time, because since it is before this crisis, I feel like most people in Europe did not feel any attachment or any relation to people in Ukraine, and they also did not to people from a lot of North African and Central Asian states. So yeah, do you think this is gonna change the perception of refugees that we have in the world? Do you think this is gonna, or do you think everything is gonna just snap back to normality? Because I mean,
for sure, no, it's gonna have a huge impact. I think because we have a living kind of like actually proof of what will happen if there's gonna be armed conflict. And I want to take make a little kind of comment on the refugees. Because my parents, my mom and my siblings, they kind of ran from Ukraine to Prague right now. And I think without volunteers, it would have been hell. Because, so just a little background. So the Ukrainian people, they're kind of divided now. So the people, like some people stay in Ukraine and they're being kind of like the partisan kind of work. So they are catching matadors, they are doing actually like freaking living people shields in front of machinery, which is insane. And they are getting rid of marks and etc. And the other part was children mostly, and also the ones that like in the hidden kind of places, which is around Kiev, which is the capital. They were living, and the first wave was to the actual Western Ukraine, which now in order to leave the Western Ukraine, you have to stay there for 3 and 4 days in traffic because there's such a big flow of people. And if there was no refugees, people would have literally been going even more hell because volunteers. So the volunteers give you like the food because people living with nothing. They give you food, they give you shelter, and they give you even possibility to move, to transfer, to travel around. And this is just crazy help. No one expected that. My mom made a comment that no one expected to be helped. Everyone was relying on their own resources, on their own kind of cars, or their own people that live abroad, which is also like some people are staying in the villages in the Western Ukraine, and the people who know some people abroad in Europe, or people who have some relatives, they all leave to Europe because it's safer that way. And my family traveled with a few other people, and they were traveling for through 5 countries in the span of 5 days, or with 10 hours a day, driving. And it's crazy because some of them so there were women and children, and women before never driven so long through so many countries, and it was just so exhausting. But volunteers, they when my family was going through Hungary and through Romania, and they were staying in the cafes, in the restaurants where you could sleep. So it wasn't even hotels, but even my family had the best kind of, let's say it like that, resources. We had a car, we had money in order that we could afford stay in the hotels and stuff. And some people go barefoot, no cars, they're going buy food through the through countries, and it's insane to me. And I think the worst part about leaving, as my mom also mentioned, is to saying goodbye to husbands and dads, because you don't know if you're gonna see them again ever. Yeah. And it's just crazy to me. And now people saying, and also there was a group of people, so it was 11 people in total, so 4 children, 12, 15, 3 months was a little child, and you had to split up in Prague because you cannot stay in such a big group of people in one place. No one's gonna actually, it's not possible. So splitting arms was also hard, but I'm just glad and thankful for the volunteers in other countries who helped with such little things as food, shelter, running water, and etc. And now it's just good to have contact, and people just also having plans, which is kind of not funny, but interesting to see how people we're gonna go back, we're gonna marry, we're gonna have children, we're gonna rebuild the whole country, and people are being more optimistic, which is great that no one's giving up hope.
very positive, I guess.
Yes.
In the face of so
True.
many tough times.
Yes, like
Yeah.
people say like we're gonna go back and
Yeah.
like have like 5 children.
It's an interesting thing. I feel like also most things I saw from Ukrainian people being interviewed by different media sources were quite positive
Yeah.
still, and quite I mean, I feel like the natural reaction after would be to be completely frustrated, devastated, and so on. But the people were quite positive in that sense, which surprised me, I have to say.
Also considering the fact that there's so many Ukrainians that came back, was it 60,000 people or 80,000? More than 100,000
Yes,
people that
there's-
came back to fight.
There is like no my father, he wanted to go, but my mom was like, "You're no way you're going because you have 3 children to take care of," and he wanted to, he couldn't because there is no place in the military anymore. Because people are coming, and a lot of them are untrained soldiers. And this is really dangerous to put an untrained soldier to the field. So they're going through trainings, and it takes time, and there's a lot of people, so there is not even place to train anymore. Which is amusing in a great way, because people are going to fight, and there's no place to put people in. This is just, wow.
This is great.
I mean, in terms of the response, going back to that, the humanitarian aid, I think the response has been quite incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about the extent of the sanctions, is it enough, things like that. But the humanitarian aid has been incredible, and it needs to keep coming, obviously. I mean, I have my own opinions about my country, good and bad, but in terms of how we've responded, in the space of 10 days, 1.5 million people crossed into Poland. In the space of 10 days. This is unprecedented. And there's not a single refugee camp in Poland, because every Ukrainian family has found a house, a hotel to live in. And so I think the response has been incredible, but obviously we need more. And
That's true. But the trust is amazing that you can see throughout humanity, and I think this is also an important part about these kind of wars and conflicts, to not forget that there's always a political side and there's an economic side with sanction, but there's also really like humanitarian side, which shines pretty bright right now.
Yeah, and I think we need not to forget that we compare crises, and in general, I don't like I said before, I don't like comparing two bad things, but the crisis in 2015, Europe accepted 1.5 million, right, refugees. This time, Europe is expected to accept 4 million refugees. That's the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. The scale is very, very different. And in terms of comparing these topics, is a very, very sensitive topic. But I think why the response, particularly in this case, was so quick, or such a great response, because it was so, first of all, geographically close, and second thing, it was historically close. We have this historic trauma, and especially in East Europe, being occupied. We feel that this is a narrative that we've been repeating for 30 years, and West Europe is not listening to us. And finally, when it happens, when Russians attack Ukraine, like, everyone cried. Like, that's a very personal touch, but everyone cried, including myself, because it feels like they invaded my land as well. Right? And therefore the response, I think it was so hard, because it was like brothers, sisters. That's how we call Ukrainians now. And I think that also explains the response, why the response is as it is these days. I don't think it as much to do, because people use the term white privilege, which is completely other topic, but I think it's in this situation for East Europeans is very relatable, and I'm quite saddened by the fact that it's put in such negative light sometimes.
I mean, you have to also think about where this kind of pessimistic view of this kind of migration, or selective migration, I've heard that term before, is used, and a lot of these sources that are being put out about all this racism that these people of color in Ukraine are experiencing. This is actually, if you look at the source, it comes straight from the Kremlin. And there was actually a pretty loud case recently about colored students on the border, people of color, on the border of Ukraine and Poland, being sent to the back of the line. And that was huge. That blew up all over social media. Now, the truth is that it wasn't about the color of their skin, it's about the gender. They were actually men, and they were sent further back in line because priority was given to women and children. But it was blown out of proportion and made to look like there's systematic racism on the border of Poland, and they're not letting in people of color. This is simply false news. And it was peddled by Russian sources, put out on by Russian TikTokers as well, Russian social media influencers, Instagram influencers. It blew up everywhere, and well-meaning people, students like me, and fell for it. The only reason why I know that this isn't true is because my father was on the border, and he was one of the people organizing the aid and the refugees coming through the border. And so he saw firsthand what had happened, and he told me the truth. But if I hadn't known that, if I hadn't gotten that source directly, I would have thought otherwise. I would have thought worse of my own country. And so I think what we need to do right now is be very wary of any kind of information that we find about, the entire conflict, obviously, but we need to critically think about where these sources are coming from, who's giving this information out, and why.
Yeah, and I think this is what you mentioned just right now. I think, like we talked about, a propaganda machine. It's perfected to the point where it's really difficult to notice that it's even propaganda, because what Putin has been doing these past years is that he was targeting the most critical, by default critical, of the West policies part of the society, which is progressive left. And that the content that is being created is created to appeal to that part and set them against their own governments. And I think you need to be, again, very, very careful with any sort of slogans and quickly jump into, condemning people in this conflict.
I think it goes also to the, I think people now get more aware about the situation in the conflict. And I think a lot of people will want to go back to see the origin of it, which also is talking about the originating of the source, because I think a lot of sources, even coming back to 2014, were publishing different kind of, let's say it's called scenarios about what actually happened. So you have to be also careful about sources that go way back.
Yeah. Well, we talked a bit about the response of the humanitarian response of the West. I would like to slightly touch on the more political and economic responses of Western countries, of the US right now. How do you see actions by NATO taken so far? Do you guys think there should have been a military intervention way earlier already, since it all rests on the shoulders of Ukrainian civil society right now? Do you think it is a more safe strategy to go for an appeasement politic, or how do you assess this?
Well, that's my very, very personal opinion. I wouldn't dive into talking about no-fly zone or NATO because, again, I'm not a strategist, and we are talking about the Third World War on the table. So I would refrain from that. But every time someone is suggesting to go for appeasement, people don't realize what they're asking of Ukrainians, because if Ukraine will remain neutral, Ukraine not gonna just remain independent and neutral. There's probably gonna be a Russian puppet government or something like that. Plus, the amount of prosecutions that will follow, the horror that will come with it. Just look at what Stalin did in 1937, 38, as I just said, or what is being done in Russia today. So I don't think appeasement is on the table at all, because you're literally asking for even more victims and more sorrow.
Yeah, and especially this is not the first time that this is happening. I mean, we talked about Crimea for a second, we talked about Georgia for a second, so I can also imagine that people living in these regions, especially in Georgia, feel quite left alone, since there was not so much offering of help. And
I think there's an existing not a fear, but people are reluctant to compare Putin to the likes of Stalin or Hitler. But I think we need to slowly stop being afraid of comparing Putin to those kinds of leaders, because he's already shown that he's willing to commit things like genocide and a targeted kind of extermination of a certain kind of people. And he's going to continue doing that unless he's stopped. And the only, I think, language that Putin understands is that of force. And I'm not saying that we should be going to war. I'm not saying that we should be eager to fight him. But I think what we need to do is, as the EU, as NATO, put forward a united military front and show him that he can't cross a certain line.
I couldn't agree more, because there have been a few peace talking in Russia and also in other cities, when the Russian delegates and Ukrainian delegates kind of tried to talk it out, which didn't end up either way good. And the Russia actually asks of Ukraine of impossible things, for instance, to never actually consider being part of the EU or part of the NATO, or like to stop armed like aggression, right, towards Russian people. So there's like a list which we cannot just, the Ukrainian cannot accept it. It's just it's crazy what they ask for. So I think there is no way of doing it through peace, unfortunately. And also about NATO, now it's ongoing talk about the closing the sky, which unfortunately I think is not going to happen. Yeah. It's not going to happen, but I think it would have helped. Like I'm saying, just like as a citizen who wants to that my country stays safe, I would want that, but unfortunately it's not real.
I think, and one more little thing that I would add is that what is Ukraine fighting today for is not just whether to be part of NATO. It's whether to be a free, independent country. And you can be critical or skeptical of the West, and you have a right to have that. But what is on the table, again, it's a matter of freedom, and people really underestimate what freedom means. Because if Ukraine loses, or if the West won't help enough, there won't be Ukraine. There will be just authoritarian Russian regime.
Yes. And about the regime, going back again to the 2014, there was a lot of people that were like pro-Russians, like on Donbass, Lugansk, and in Crimea. That's why it was so easy on quote, like to take in, because people had some pro-Russian ideology, some pro-Russian understanding of what's going to be better, right? But now people are taking back their words there because they lived in 8 years with that ideology, and it's not just people are saying we're taking back, it was a mistake, it was bad. And coming from my mom, she talked to some people who lived on like in Donbass and in other hot spots, and they're saying that we will come back to rebuild Ukraine, as I mentioned before, but only if Ukraine wins. Because if Russia wins, no one's going to come back, because living under that regime, no one wants that.
Yeah, and what you said before, I mean, you can think of Western nations whatever you want, and there's a lot of things I personally see quite critical, how especially, for example, the US is making a lot of money out of this conflict again, selling weapons since 2017 to these countries. But it's true, I mean, if it's not Western European countries right now, who else is going to step in there and protect this kind of freedom, this kind of liberty that we have in our countries in our world right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could discuss the lack of a response to the US invasion of Iraq. You could discuss whether NATO was expanding and that worried Russia, how much the EU could have done to prepare for this conflict. But at the end of the day, I think the situation right now is pretty black and white. I think it is clear who is the aggressor. I think Putin invaded a sovereign state of Ukraine. Civilians are dying in the city of Mariupol in the south. 2,500 people have died in that city alone since the conflict has started. And we must act. And I think the rest of Europe is next if we don't stop Putin right now. And I think Ukrainian President, correct me if I pronounce his name wrong, Zelensky.
Yeah, that's right.
I think he said it best. He said, "Who will suffer most? The people. Who doesn't want it the most? The people. Who can stop it? The people." And I think that links nicely to both the situation in Ukraine and actually within Russia.
All right, guys, thank you very much for coming towards the end of this. I think this is a very nice statement to stop this year. Thank you for all your opinions, for your point of views. It was really insightful to have the opinion of people that are actually from countries in this region. Thank you very much for coming today.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.